It's election day. It's 8 p.m. Central. It's apparently the closest election on record. It's neck and neck. And I was reliably told that this is the most important election of our lifetime. Yes, it's true. They said that about every election going back 250 years. But apparently this is the most important one of our lifetime. And we have to be watching the early returns to find out what's going to happen. But no, while the rest of the country is glued to the TV, watching the breathless returns, we're gathering together to study the Almighty's Torah on the Parsha podcast, and not just any Parsha podcast. This is the inaugural edition of the Parsha podcast live on torchzoom.com. It's an election special edition, we could call it. We're going to make it an extra long one in honor of the election. It's the Parsha podcast live on Torch Zoom. We're going to do this now for a few weeks, 10 weeks. We're going to try it out. It's an experiment. Each Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. Central, we'll do a live recording on the Parsha podcast. It's no longer me gesticulating wildly to myself. I'll gesticulate in front of an audience. We'll see how it goes. Once we finish the book of Genesis, we can reassess to see if we want to keep it going forward. Do you have an opinion? If you're listening to audio only, does it sound different? Am I pandering? Am I playing to the crowd? Send me your feedback. rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. This is the third episode of year 9 of the Parsha podcast. And the theme this year is Torah is our ID. We're learning about what we stand for as a nation. Who are we? What makes us special? And the answer is Torah. Torah is our ID. Each week, please God, we will reinforce that notion with an idea or ideas. In our case, 2 ideas in the Parsha, followed by a dilemma from the Parsha. So let's begin. It's Parshas Lecha, and we meet the most consequential person of all time. Abraham, he's initially called Abraham. His name gets changed in the Parsha. He begins a mission to perfect the world. He begins a mission to restore righteousness to the world. He begins the monumental effort to purge the world of the sin of Adam, to cleanse humanity from that horrific sin and its noxious consequences. Abraham emerges in a world that's dark. It's spiritually dark. It's spiritually vacuous. It's spiritually bleak. Idolatry has taken over. The name of God is forgotten. The world has turned away from its creator. And Abraham begins the process of turning the ship around, of altering the trajectory of the world and turning it back towards God. And there's a remarkable midrash that charts what happened in the world up to Abraham and what happened from Abraham onward. The midrash charts the degradation of humanity up to Abraham and how he got the world back on track. The midrash tells us that the presence of God was really supposed to be here in this world. Adam and Eve, they sensed the Spirit of God in the garden. God was here. But then Adam sinned. And when Adam sinned, the presence of God departed from the world, and it went up to the next spiritual sphere. But that's not where it stayed. Cain came around, and he did a terrible crime. He killed his brother, and the presence of God went up yet another notch to the second sphere. And then Enosh sinned, and it went up to the third sphere, and the people of the flood sinned again and went up to the next level. And the people of the dispersion, the people of the Tower of Babel, they sinned and God went up yet higher. And the Sodomites came and God went up higher. And finally, the Egyptians came and they made the world so inhospitable to God that God, so to speak, the presence of God went up to the highest level, the most distance between God and his creation. With these 7 eras of sinfulness and spiritual decay, the presence of God progressively departed from the world. And then Abram, soon to be Abraham, emerged. And the presence of God was the furthest it could possibly be from his creation. It's in the seventh and highest sphere. It's the most distanced from this world. Humanity, God's primary, ultimate creation, was totally estranged from its creator. And Abraham arrives, and he begins to reverse this. He reverses the distance between the world and God. He begins to do this process of bridging the gap between the creator and his creation. Abraham came and took the presence of God from the highest level one notch lower. And then came Isaac and moved it a notch lower. And then came Jacob and moved it a notch lower. And then came Levi, the son of Jacob, and he moved it lower. And Kahas, son of Levi. And then Amram, son of Kahas. And finally Moshe. Moshe restored the world to the ideal that was present before the sin of Adam. The presence of God descended upon Mount Sinai. Things were fixed. Things were the way they were previously. The sin of Adam, at least if you looked at Sinai, the sin of Adam was purged. God once again dwelled here on terra firma on Mount Sinai. That's what Abraham began. Abraham was that first critical step in changing the trajectory of humanity. And yes, of course, Moshe finished. He completed what Abraham began. He undid the sin of Adam and, so to speak, brought God to this world. But Abraham got it all started. And we meet him in our Parsha. And the primary focus of the rest of the Torah is going to be on Abraham and his family and his descendants and the tribe that they spawn and eventually the nation that emerges from Abraham. And in this is Parsha. We begin with Abraham. And he's traveling. And he travels with Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother-in-law / nephew, and all the souls that they had made in Haran, all their followers. And they travel to Canaan. And the Torah maps out their itinerary. They're going all over the land, crisscrossing, traversing the land. Abraham builds an altar. He calls out in the name of God, begins to publicize the name of God to the people of the land. And then we read that there's a famine. And they go down to Egypt. And Sarai, well, she's not my wife. She's my sister. She gets taken to Pharaoh. Eventually they discover that, well, she's actually married to Abraham. And they banish Abraham and his retinue. But first they shower them with all sorts of gifts. And they return to Canaan. So we're following the storyline, the narrative, the character arc of Abraham and his people. They return to Canaan, and there's a scuffle that breaks out between Lot and his shepherds and Abraham and his shepherds, and they amicably part ways. Lot, he heads to the luscious, rich, fertile lands of Sodom and Gomorrah, lands, unfortunately, that are occupied with terrible sinners, and Abraham no longer has any sidekicks. God appears to him. God promises him, you'll be the father of a great nation. Your descendants will be as numerous as the dust of the earth. They will inherit the land of Canaan. These wonderful promises that happen to Abraham, that God gives to Abraham once Lot departs from him. If you actually count in our Parsha, there are 4 times where God promises Abraham, the land of Canaan. And the Parsha continues. We're following the story of Abraham, and there's a world war. This is in chapter 14. 4 mighty empires waging war against 5 empires. And the 4 overpower the 5, and they overrun their territories, and they capture and plunder the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Lot, who had moved there after he departed from Abraham, he's now a captive. Abraham is told about the capture of his brother-in-law, his nephew, and he joins the war. Abraham throws his hat into this worldwide conflict. He commissions warriors. They pursue the victors. Abraham goes to war. He smites them. And he regains all the people and all the possessions, and he rescues Lot. And we follow the story of Abraham further. Chapter 15, there's the covenant between the parts. Abraham is told about the fact that his descendants will be enslaved and tormented and oppressed for 400 years. They'll be in foreign lands, and then they'll have a miraculous exile. And then we read about the story of Abraham and his wife and the decision, the saga of Hagar and Ishmael. Sarah is barren, She is infertile. And she comes up with a scheme by which she can earn the merit to bear children. She's infertile, and she understands that the reason why she has no children is because God does not find her worthy enough. So she says, I'm going to become worthier. I'm going to do something which is very difficult. I'm going to overcome a difficult test, a challenge, and that will render me worthy to have a child of my own. And what's the most difficult thing I can undertake? I'm going to take my maidservant, Hagar. I'm going to give her to Abraham as a concubine, and I'll bear that terrible, painful experience, and that will earn me the merit that I need to bear a child of my own. Hagar is given to Abraham, and she immediately becomes pregnant, and she begins to belittle her mistress. I'm more righteous, she claims, than Sarah. Sarah oppresses her, and she flees, and she meets the angel at the well, and they have a conversation, and the angel says, go back to your mistress, bear her oppression. An angel foretells you'll have a son, name him Ishmael. He'll be the father of a very populous nation. Now, important to note, this is not the only conversation that Hagar has with an angel. In next week's Parsha, after Ishmael's already born, and after Ishmael is misbehaving and they're banished, they again encounter an angel, and Ishmael's about to die, and he is shown, or the angel shows Hagar where the well in the desert is. And that's next week's Parsha, not to be confused with the event in this week's Parsha, where Hagar alone flees from the oppression that she's experiencing at the hands of Sarah, and she meets the angel who tells her to go back. And the Parsha ends with chapter 17. Abram is finally renamed Abraham. Sarai becomes Sarah. Abram is again promised the land. He's given the covenant of the circumcision. And Abraham and Ishmael and all the males in Abraham's household are circumcised. Next week we pick up with the aftermath of that. Abraham's recovering, and he has 3 visitors. That is next week. The first idea I want to cover today is studying intently the story of Abraham and his journey. Abraham, he's a monotheist. His father is an idolater. His whole town, a town of idolaters. The whole society and culture in which he lives, growing up in the city of Ur in southern Iraq today. It's a whole culture built upon idolatry. And Abraham becomes a monotheist. He says everyone else is wrong. There's only one God. All power is coalesced in one divine entity. Everything else is really powerless. Now, Abraham is a monotheist, but he's not really the first monotheist, and he's not really the only monotheist of his time. People don't realize this, but Abraham was 58 years old when Noah died. Do the math. So Abraham overlapped with Noah and Noah's children. Shem is one of the sons of Noah. They met in our Parsha. Shem and Abraham. Aver, which is another antecedent of Abraham from the line of Shem via Noah. These were righteous people. These were certainly monotheists, but Abraham is in a class of his own. And the commentaries tell us that there are 2 crucial differences between Abraham and his fellow contemporary monotheists. Unlike Noah, unlike Shem, unlike Abraham had no help from tradition. He discovered the truth of God and monotheism completely on his own. Everyone else had a tradition that came back from Noah, from Adam. Abraham had nothing. He discovered it via the use of his own mental faculties and pursuit of truth. In addition, unlike the other monotheists that lived in Abraham's times, Abraham publicized it. Abraham began a movement. He would go from place to place and debate and engage in polemics and argue and persuade and cajole the local pagans to become monotheists. In our parsha, read the souls that Abraham made in Charan, on his way from Ur-Kasdim, from Iraq, to the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, he stopped off in a place called Charan, which is modern-day Syria. And there he didn't stop his work. He kept on publicizing the name of God. And he amassed a movement of thousands of followers, and they all came with him to the land of Canaan. And he gets to the land of Canaan. He doesn't stop. Multiple times in the Parsha it says he calls out the name of God. He makes an altar. The Ramban says that he made like a platform. He would engage in debates, public debates. He would make a platform, and he would get up and argue with people and eventually persuade them all to become believers. So Abraham is very special. He is very noteworthy. His contributions are enormous because he is the one who not only discovered the truth of God on his own, but publicized it and began the process of fixing the world. But if we study his storyline, you notice that the Torah dedicates a lot of attention to Abraham and to all of his journeys and all of his interactions and travails. And we know the Torah doesn't tell us anything that's just nice trivia to be able to map out where Abraham went and what he did and who he spoke to. It's all instructive for us. Our sages tell us everything that Abraham did, we are encouraged. Nay, we are required to emulate, to mimic. The deeds of our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we must copy them. So when we're reading all these descriptions of what Abraham's doing and who he's talking to and how he's described the places he went to, that's all part of Torah. That's all part of the instructive component of the Torah. It's not history. It's lessons. And I think when we carefully study Abraham's storyline in our Parsha, we get some specifics about Abraham, what he accomplished. And as a result, what we ought to strive to emulate and mimic. Abraham has a nickname in our Parsha. Yes, he's called Abram, and then he's called Abraham, but he has another nickname in our Parsha. Chapter 14, verse 13. This is in the middle of the World War. Lot's and the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and there's this 4 kings against the 5 kings, and Abraham gets involved. Why does he get involved? Because someone comes to him, a refugee from the war, comes to Abraham then known as Abraham. We're just calling him Abraham, okay? You know, sometimes he's called Abraham. We're just going to, for simplicity's sake, we're going to call him Abraham. So the refugee comes to Abraham and says to him, "Oh, you don't realize what happened? That they got Lot. They captured Lot. You got to go save him." But the verse does not say he comes to Abraham or Abraham. It says, Abram ha-Ivri. The Ivri, which means the Hebrew. There's one place in the Torah where Abram is given this nickname. He's called Avram, ha-Ivri, the Hebrew. Why is Abram going to be given a nickname over here? So the Midrash asks this question, why is it called Avram ha-Ivri? And the Midrash offers 4 different answers. Well, his ancestor was Aver, so he's the Ivrite, meaning he's from the family of Aver. Or Aver means from the other side. He came from the other side of the river. Everyone else is on one side of the river, he's on the other side. Or he speaks the language of Ivri, of Hebrew. Alternatively, the Midrash says the reason why he's called Ivri, meaning from the other side, yes, he's from the other side of the river, but he might as well be on the other side of the world. Because if you looked at the world, you mapped at the world, and you looked at the philosophy and the personality and the character of all the people in the world, and you want to divide them up into groups, into categories, you'd put Abraham on one side and literally every other person on the other side. Abraham was completely different from every other person. All of humanity was on one side, and Abraham was alone on the other side. And that's why he has this curious nickname, Abraham ha-Ivri, the loner on the other side, away from everyone else. This is one of Abraham's defining qualities. You can imagine a border. On one side is Abraham, and it's like a river. Think of it as a river, a border. One side is Abraham, and he's completely alone, and the entire world is on the other side. What the Torah is telling us is that Abraham is a completely unique, an utterly unique individual. He's a maverick who stood alone. All of his contemporaries, they look at him like he's a Martian, okay? He's a Martian. He's a total iconoclast, completely different than everyone else. They're all idolaters, all of them. But Abraham is someone who's different. He's alone. He's blazing for himself a brand new path. He's on one side. Everyone else is on the other side. This is a description of Abraham in our Parsha. Now, what does it mean that Abraham was in a class of his own? What does it mean that he's on one side whereas everyone else is on the other side? What does it look like when someone is completely unique, alone amongst their peers? So I want to suggest a bit of an understanding, a deeper understanding into Abraham and why he's so unique and so special in the Torah and, of course, in the annals of human history. The Parsha begins, Abraham is traveling. He's going to Canaan. And our sages tell us, well, Abraham was tested 10 times, and this is the first test. He's told to leave your homeland, leave your birthplace, leave the house of your father, and go to the unknown. Abandon everything that you've had hitherto and go to the unknown. So, of course, that's a challenge. That's a difficulty. That's a test. That's a trial. But it's much more than simply being a physical test. The danger of the unknown. Abraham's being told to also forfeit his standing, his spiritual standing. The Torah tells us that he had a movement, a fledgling movement that he had built in Charan. There were souls that he made in Charan. And he left, he departed, and he leaves from Charan, and he goes to Canaan. And he gets there, and he's not sure if he'll have that same impact, the same influence in Canaan, but he does it. Abraham, the beginning of his story is that he travels from Charan, and he's embarking upon this journey to go to Canaan. Now, if you read just our Parsha, you may be under the impression that Abraham, he was the first one to do this. He was the first one to embark upon a journey, a voyage, an odyssey to Canaan. But the truth is, he was not the first. There are 2 verses that are only 6 verses apart from each other. One at the end of last week's Parsha, Parshas Noach, and one at the very beginning of our Parsha, Parshas Lecha. And they describe 2 journeys to Canaan. Chapter 11 of Genesis, verse 31, it tells us, Terach is the father of Abraham. Terach took Abraham and Lot and Sarah, and they departed from Ur, which is the original hometown, and they departed Leches Arza Canaan, to go to the land of Canaan. And they arrived until Charan, and they stopped there, they settled there. We have a description of a journey that Terach spearheaded. And he departed his hometown in Ur, in Iraq, to go Leches, to go Arza Canaan, to the land of Canaan. You fast forward 6 verses later, Terach is no longer part of the picture. They had stopped in Charan. Another verse is talking about Abraham's journey. And it's like the identical words. Vayetzu laleches arza Canaan. We have 2 verses that are only 6 verses apart. It's talking about 2 groups traveling to the land of Canaan. One of them is being headed by Terach and one being headed by Abraham. So if I were to ask you, who was the first person to embark upon a journey to the land of Canaan, most experts in the Torah would erroneously say, well, that's Abraham. The truth is, his father preceded him. He embarked to go to Canaan, but he didn't get there. He stopped in Charan and he settled there. His journey to the land was aborted. It ended premature. Now, Terach, what do we know about Abraham's father? We know he was an idolater. We know that when Abraham chose a different path of monotheism, he was almost executed, and the sources tell us, the Midrash tells us, that his own father wanted him killed. So Terach is not a good guy. He's like polar opposites with his son Abraham. Yet the verse tells us, chapter 11, verse 31, look it up, don't trust me. Terach wanted to go to the land of Canaan. What did he want to do there? Why did he want to go to the land of Canaan? So this is be very surprising. Because I was always trained, Terach, he's a terrible guy. He was an idol salesman, and then he led his son Abraham to take over the shop, and then this is the midrash that every child is told, right? He took over the shop, and Abraham took the sledgehammer and smashed all the idols, and then there was only one idol left, the biggest, strongest one. He put the hammer in his hand, and Terach comes back, and everything's in shambles. And he says, well, don't blame me. He did it. He can't do it. Well, if he can't do it, if he's so ineffectual, why do you bow down? Why do you genuflect to these idols of wood and stone? And Terach grabbed Abraham and said, you're going to be arrested. And he brought him to Nimrod, and Nimrod wanted to throw him in the fire. This is the story of Abraham's father. Yet the verse, in every version of the Torah, tells us he wanted to go to the land of Canaan. He didn't end up there, but he wanted to go. And to make things a bit more interesting, the commentators, the classic commentators on the Torah, asked the question, well, what did he seek that he wanted to go to the land of Canaan? Initially, he didn't make it there, but why did he want to go? So the Sepharno, one of the very ancient commentators on the Torah, he says something remarkable. Terach wanted to go to Canaan because it's the land that is most designated for enabling spiritual and intellectual greatness. If you want to have a connection, a close, intimate connection with the Almighty, the best place to find that is in the land of Canaan, what we call today the land of Israel. When the flood swamped the whole world, it rained on every land but the land of Canaan. This land was not polluted by the toxic effects of the flood. It preserved the pre-flood world. It remained untouched by the ill effects of the flood. And that's why it's a special place. If you want to become elevated and spiritual and close to the Almighty, you go to this land. And Terach, father of Abraham, he knew that secret. If you want to grow almonds, there's certain climates and certain atmospheres that it will grow best in. You grow them in California, and grapes in southern France. And you want to grow an esrog for Sukkot, you don't plant it in Canada, in the tundra, or in Idaho. In Idaho, you put the potatoes, and this you put in Morocco. And pistachios, apparently they're the best in Iran. And of course, avocados from Mexico. Of course. This is true for physical fruits. It's also true for the fruits of humanity. The Torah tells us way later in the Torah, that a person is an eitz hasad, is a fruit, is a tree of the field. Our deeds are like fruits. Our righteousness is like fruits. Well, which land is best suited for growing people? Which climate is best suited for allowing people to flourish and to grow and to achieve their highest potential? Which land has the ideal conditions for people to maximize their enormous spiritual potential? That's the land of Israel. And Terach, father of Abraham, former idolater, he knew this. And that's why chapter 11, verse 31 of the book of Genesis, he went and he embarked to go to the land of Canaan. He didn't have prophecy. He didn't know that he's supposed to go there. But he went. At least he started the journey. And only 6 verses later, we read a very similar verse where Abraham did this. 2 verses, 6 verses apart. In one, Terach, Abraham's idolatrous father, he embarks on the journey to Canaan. Chapter 12, verse 5, Abraham does the same thing. There's something very special about this land, and Terach knew it, and Abraham knew it, and they both sought to go to the land of Canaan, but Terach stopped. He got halfway to Charan, and he never made it to Canaan. Now, why did he stop? The Torah tells us that he set out to go to the land of Canaan. He stopped in Charan and he settled there and he died there. He didn't finish his journey. Why was he happy in Charan? What's the appeal of Charan? It doesn't say. The Torah doesn't tell us. I suspect that Ur, the site of origin for everyone involved in the story, that was like the worst spiritual place. And Terach and Abraham, they were both inspired to leave and to go to the best spiritual place. But they got halfway, Charan, and it was a much better place. It was much loftier spiritually than Ur, than the original place where they departed from. And when Terach, when he achieved a modicum of the spiritual greatness that he had sought, he's happy. He's content. And he settles in Charan. And he never goes for the gold. He never makes it to the land. And the final verse of last week's Parsha, Parsha Noach, Vayamas Terach b'Charan. Terach died in Charan. Even after Abraham went to Canaan and Abraham flourished in Canaan, he didn't join him. And if you look at the commentary of Rashi, Rashi says that Terach spiritually died in Charan. Terach, he's undergoing this metamorphosis, this spiritual renewal. He had been in Ur, he was an idolater. He tried to get Abraham burnt at the stake. But something changed, and he had an awakening, and he says, that's it, we're going to Canaan. We're going to forge a close relationship with the Almighty. He had wanted the spiritual greatness that was only possible in the land. At that point, he's still spiritually alive. Because yes, he has some tortured history, and he has a checkered past, but he's still grappling, probing, wrestling, questioning. He's still spiritually alive because he's still spiritually searching and pursuing. He's not quite a lost cause. So he sets out for Canaan. He's moved and inspired and motivated to change. But halfway, he settles down in Charan, and he's content with a half job. And the Torah tells us he died there. This is his spiritual death sentence. That's Terach. Abraham is halfway with his father, and he goes further. He sets out to go to the land, and he actually arrives there. And our sages tell us, the Torah tells us that he's an Ivri. He's alone. He's in a class of his own. He could be on one side of the equation, and everyone else in the entire world is on the other side. Many may have been inspired to do what Abraham did, but in his lifetime, he was the only one. Now, if we want to go even a little bit deeper, we could actually pinpoint the difference between Abraham's journey and Terach's journey. Why couldn't Terach go the distance? Why did he founder in Charan? What separates Terach's journey from Abraham's. If you study those two almost identical verses, you see a very subtle difference. Genesis 11:31 versus Genesis 12:5. Both of them talks about departing with the intention of arriving in Canaan. But there's a bit of a difference. When Terach leaves, chapter 11, verse 31, it says, I'll read you the actual words, Vayetzu itam me'ur kasdem. He's leaving from Ur, and he's going to the land of Canaan. Fast forward 6 verses, Abraham's in Charan, and he's leaving as well now to the land of Canaan, but the Torah does not identify his point of origin. It doesn't tell us where he departs from. Perhaps we can suggest Terach, when he left, it was still leaving from Ur. He had maybe like an eye facing backwards at Ur. He wasn't totally committed to going to Canaan. He took a little bit of his previous self with him. And therefore he gets halfway. That's good enough. Terach didn't dissociate his previous self. He didn't burn his boats. He didn't cross the Rubicon. He didn't sever his association with his point of origin. And therefore, once he got a little bit of what he wanted, he found comfortable pastures, spiritual pastures in Charan. Well, that's good enough. He's satisfied at the halfway point between Ur and Canaan. Whereas, by contrast, when Abraham departed, the verse does not identify his point of origin. He's solely focused on arriving in Canaan, and he's willing to say goodbye to his previous self. We don't even know where that's from. He's like a brand new person, clean slate, starting from scratch. He makes it the distance. Now, Abraham arrives in Canaan, but his journey doesn't end. He travels all over the land, goes from this place to that place, steadily making his way further south as he crisscrosses the land. And then there's a famine, and he has to go to Egypt. And he goes to Egypt, and the whole time, there's someone else traveling with Abraham. There's a fellow traveler. Someone who went from Ur, together with Terach, to Charan, and then went with Abraham and Sarah and Sarai to Canaan, and all over Canaan, and down to Egypt. And of course, that's Lot. Lot's with him along his journey every step of the way. But when Abraham returns from Egypt, Lot drops off the train. Abraham's fellow travelers are winnowed yet further. Lot was part of this journey, and he held on tight for a very long time. But even Lot didn't quite go the distance. The verse tells us Abraham was ivri. He's the only one who was totally 100% committed to God, come what may. Yes, there were people who started the journey with him. Terach made a significant move. He wanted to go to Canaan. He was desirous of that. He embarked upon that journey, but he got halfway from Ur to Charan. Lot was with him. He went further, but in the end, Abraham stood alone. Now, I will tell you that the commentaries tell us that Lot was richly rewarded for accompanying Abraham along his journey. Even though Lot's going to have a very ignominious end to his storyline in the Torah, I want to spoil it for you. Next week's Parsha. Lot has a very famous descendant. Even though there's some very inglorious origins to the story, Lot spends a couple of nights in a cave with his daughters, and they become pregnant. It's very embarrassing. It's scandalous. But Lot, the heir of Lot is Ruth, and her great grandson is David. And David is the line of the Davidic line, and Messiah comes from David. So Messiah's ancestor, one of them, is Lot. How did Lot merit to have such absolute luminaries as his descendants, such prestigious descendants? Because he went with Abraham. And he went when it got hard and Terach fell off. He was still there. Yes, he didn't make a distance. But that merit stood for him. And ultimately, part of his lineage and his heritage actually became great contributors to the mission of Abraham and to this nation. Abraham, in the end, stood alone. He was on the other side of the river. And of course, that means literally he came from the other side of the river. He came from the other side of the Euphrates. But that's not what our sages are telling us. Abraham had to work really hard to achieve what he achieved. He had to traverse a river, and he can't go over it. You can't go under it. You got to go through it. Abraham had to wade through the rapids and swim through the currents and navigate the perilous waves. Every moment that he was in the river, he's being pushed back. But he persevered, and he went the distance. This is what the Torah is telling us the whole story of Abraham and contrasting it with others that embarked on that to tell us that Abraham is Ivri. He's the only one who went the full distance. This is one of his defining characteristics. This is his nickname that is given to Torah. And this is what we are encouraged to try to emulate. Now, it's really interesting. When are we told this nickname of Abraham? Chapter 14, it's like we're into the story. Chapter 12, chapter 13, it's the middle of chapter 14 in our Parsha. Abraham's already been to Canaan, down to Egypt, back, split off from Lot. There's a world war. And a refugee comes from the war. It tells him, by the way, Lot was captured. And then suddenly Abraham he's told Abraham, Ha'ivri, the one who stands alone. Wouldn't it make more sense if the first verse of our Parsha, chapter 12, verse 1, God said to Abram, Ha'ivri, the Hebrew, Lech Lecha, depart, me'artzecha, from your land, from your place of birth, from the home of your father. Why are we given his nickname so much later in the game? So perhaps this accentuates Abraham's superlative kindness, even though he's on the other side of the river and everyone else in the world, including Lot, is on the other side. You may have thought, well, Abraham doesn't care as much for someone who's on the other side playing for that team. Maybe he wouldn't endanger himself to go save Lot, who's not really aligned with Abraham. And therefore, to accentuate Abraham's kindness, it tells us that he's Ivri, and nevertheless, he endangered himself. But there's another idea. I think this really brings home the greatness of Abraham. Imagine I told you there's a world war. 4 kings against 5 kings. Oh, and bad news, your nephew / brother-in-law, he was taken captive. You have to be nuts. You gotta be crazy to go take a stand and fight the victors of this war. Abraham is behaving very irrationally, we would say. He's being completely unreasonable. What's Abraham thinking that he could thrust himself into this world war and save his brother-in-law / nephew, Lot? Perhaps this is the greatest manifestation of what Abraham stood for. How was he different than the rest of the world? He's on one side, whereas everyone else is on the other side. You look at Abraham's behavior in chapter 14. You see how someone of Abraham's ideology and perspective and philosophy and worldview, how they operate. Abraham is so confident that with God on his side, he is completely invulnerable, that he does what we would say is suicide. He's completely fearless. If Abraham was facing a Greek phalanx or 1,000 Roman legionnaires or a Mongolian horde or 400 Iranian ballistic missiles, he wouldn't sweat. Nothing would faze him. His perspective is only God decides who wins and who loses. And all these displays of strength, 4 kingdoms, they just rampage their way throughout the whole land. Everyone's terrified of them. Abraham looks at them the way we would look at an ant pile. Abraham is a true monotheist. There's literally only one power. Everything else is absolutely powerless. In his eyes, there's literally only one power. And in that attitude, Abraham is completely alone. And no episode demonstrates that more than what he did over here in chapter 14 in his war, in his inserting himself into this war. We like to think of ourselves as heirs of Abraham. And we are. Our people really, our whole world is. Because Abraham's attitudes have permeated the whole world. But here we get a real picture of what does it mean when the Torah tells us that he was alone on one side of the equation, on one side of the divide, on one side of the river, and everyone else was on the other side? We see in this story what that means. In our eyes, of course, God has all the power. But still, if there's a war, I want no part of it. We still attribute a little bit of power to people, to armies, to physical things. Abraham ascribes literally nothing to it. And he behaves in a way that we would say is totally reckless, but this gives us a little window into how he thinks. I think maybe there's a formula that we can make. To the degree that someone ascribes power to anything besides for God, that is the degree to which they are not ascribing power to God. Abraham was alone. He viewed the world literally like there's only one power. Everything else is just pretending to have power. And what gave Abraham the strength, the resolve, the audacity to go fight this war? To stand up fearlessly in front of the whole world? It was his true faith. I think this is maybe a lesson for us. The Torah tells us this story. You always wonder, like you're reading the story of Abraham and it tells us this chapter 14, that there's a whole war and the 14s, the 15s, and gives a whole long description. And you don't even know how this fits into the whole story until, 10, 12 verses later, suddenly Abraham's involved. To me, this is the great illustration of the standard of faith that Abraham embodied, he lived by, where he departed from everyone else in his time and really in all times. Who of us could say that even though we pay lip service to the idea that God is the only power, but still, this is what it looks like in Abraham's perspective. The sources differ as to when Abraham, or what stage in his life, he discovered God. One opinion says he was 3 years old when he discovered God. Another opinion says he was 40 years old when he discovered God. When the Rambam tells over this story, he says that really both sides are true. Abraham discovered God when he was 3, and he also discovered God when he was 40. There's a big difference between the faith that he had at 3 and the faith that he had at 40. At 3, maybe he had what we would call faith. He believes in God. There's only one power. It makes sense. It's logical. And the Midrash even talks about the calculations that he had. It can't be that there's no creator. And how could it be that the sun is the creator? The sun disappears at night and the moon's the creator? Really, that's so illogical. That level of faith he achieved when he was 3. For 37 years, he worked on himself, on his faith, to deepen it, to make it so real that it was as real to him as the fact that you have 5 fingers. If you are so fortunate. I understand the average American does not have 5 fingers, and some people lose it, and that changes the averages. Abraham had what we call 5-finger clarity in his faith. And this is what the Torah is telling us. And the fact that it's telling to us, it's instructive to us. This is what we ought to aspire to. It seems like it's a lot. But if we're told about it, at least it's within range of what we can do and what we should strive to do. We read about the stories of Abraham and his founding really of the philosophy of monotheism. This is what it means. And it should be perhaps a bit comforting to know that the qualities of Abraham became instinctive and inborn in his descendants. The ability to stand up to the world and to face the world alone, a little bit of that has been transmitted to us. I want to give one more idea here. In honor of this inaugural Parsha podcast live on torchzoom.com, it's the election night. I'm so eager to know what happened, but I'd rather spend time with y'all. I prefer this. So one more idea, a quick idea. In chapter 16, something very strange happens. Abraham, he's barren. He's childless. Sarai is childless. And she devises a scheme by which Abraham marries her maidservant, Hagar. And that will serve to earn her the merit to have a child of her own. That's very interesting. The Torah tells us what happened. Hagar became pregnant right away. And she belittled Sarah. Rashi explains she viewed herself as being superior to Sarah. Look, you've been together for 70 years and you have no children, and I'm here for a half hour and I'm pregnant. I must be more righteous than you. And Sarah gets upset. And she complains to Abraham. And Abraham says, you do what you want. And the verse tells us that Sarah treated her very harshly. Sarah was very tough on Hagar. And by the way, at the beginning of chapter 16, we discovered that, you look at Rashi, Rashi tells us that Hagar was a princess. She was a princess of Egypt. And when Abraham was so impressive and Sarah was so impressive in Egypt, Pharaoh said, my daughter, what you doing with me? She should spend time with Abraham and Sarah. It's better for her to be a maidservant there than to be a princess over here. So Hagar, she comes from royalty. And now she's being treated very harshly by her mistress, by Sarah. And she escapes. She can't handle it. And she goes to the well, and the angel finds her. And the angel engages her in conversation. Where are you coming from? Where are you going to? And she responds, I'm escaping from Sarai, my mistress. And the angel tells her, go back. Go back to your mistress, to Sarai, and submit yourself to her harsh and withering treatment. Now, parenthetically, my grandfather, blessed memory, used to always say that Sarah was an educator. She was a teacher. And she gave the cold shoulder to Hagar because Hagar had a streak of arrogance. And as a pedagogical strategy, she strategically pushed her away as a means to help her improve. The Talmud tells us that skilled teachers, they know the wisdom of drawing close with the right hand and pushing away with the left hand. Sarah calculated that the best thing that Hagar needed for her growth and development was to be pushed away a little bit. Hagar, she came from royalty. She's like, I'm out. This is too much for me. She ran away. And the angel begins to engage in conversation. Where are you coming from? Where are you going to? And she says, well, I'm escaping from Sarah, from my mistress. And the angel says, go back and suffer. And by the way, you'll have a child named Ishmael, and he'll become a leader of a very populous nation. You think about just like the worst therapist in the world. I'm suffering. I'm miserable. I'm escaping. angel says, go back and suffer. The angel doesn't provide comfort. He doesn't say everything will be all right. He says, go and suffer at the hands of Sarah. Go bear the difficulty, the pain that you were placed in. Go bite the bullet. It's a very deep lesson over here. Hagar faced a very difficult challenge. She was being treated very harshly by Sarah. And the way that she found to cope with it was to escape. There is a Hagarian philosophy over here. Difficulty, challenge, tribulation, suffering, hardship. I don't want to deal with it. I don't want to bear with it. I don't want to suffer. I don't want to absorb it. I want to flee. We can all identify with that. We may have a tendency to resist hardship and to try to cope as Hagar did by escaping. And the angel is redirecting her. Go back. You're making a mistake to try to flee. Bear the brunt of the burden that was placed upon you. This might be a very powerful lesson for us. We may have a similar tendency to run away from difficulty, from hardship. And that's because we may forget. Where are you coming from? The angel tells her. Where did this hardship originate in? We believe we're being trained that the Almighty designs our life in a way that gives us challenges and difficulties and tribulations and responsibilities that are all engineered to help us, to propel us to become greater. And he knows exactly what he's doing. If you're dealing with a challenge, just like Hagar was dealing with a challenge, the angel should be whispering into your ear, where are you coming from? Where did this come from? Remember, this came from God, and this is designed to help you grow to the next stage of your development and your advancement and your ascension to greatness. This is the lesson that Hagar is teaching us. Don't run away from difficulties. The definition of your growth, of your transformation, that's what happens when you have to wrestle with situations that maybe you wouldn't have chosen. We may have Hagarian tendencies ourselves. It's only natural. We don't want to deal with it. We don't want to bear the hardship. We want to run away. And the angel tells Hagar, as perhaps we should be hearing, where are you coming from? Where did this hardship come from? Who gave it to you? It's all from God. And therefore, remember, it's ultimately for your benefit. I think this is a very valuable lesson. We face nuisances and challenges and difficulties and hardships literally every single day. And we may be under the impression that, like, why is this all happening? Why so many nuisances that's interrupting my plans? I had carefully laid plans and the Almighty came and just totally messed it up. We have to remember that the Almighty is an active participant in our pursuit of greatness. And those obstacles and those challenges and hardships are actually there to advance our cause, not to impede it. The lesson from Hagar, lean into those challenges. Don't try to escape from them. They're given to you for a purpose. They're for your benefit. They are what will help you become great. This is a lesson we got from Hagar. She didn't quite have that same training and pedigree and greatness as Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, their spouses, their children. There's no conceivable way that Abraham, the forefathers, the matriarchs, that family would not know this intuitively. They knew that challenges are designed for our benefit and they're tailor-made for us. And I think the lesson we take from Hagar is that when you have a challenge, a hardship, a difficulty, it may be a gift from God. These are the circumstances that will catapult us to erstwhile unachievable heights. It's a gift from God. It's just got some irritating gift wrapping. It's a pain to unpack. It's a bit frustrating to open. But if you realize it's a gift, you'll never throw it away. I want to end this very special Parsha podcast with a dilemma. Torah is our ID. We got some ideas. Let's get to the dilemma. And that is Abraham's reaction to Lot's departure. In our Parsha, Abraham and Lot go their separate ways. They spent a lot of time together. They undertook a very difficult and challenging journey together. They did a lot of the journey together, and eventually they parted ways. Lot went to Sodom and Gomorrah, a place the Torah says it's just full of sinners. Well, first question is, why didn't Abraham go there? Why didn't Abraham go to the mouth of the lion? If Abraham is on the other side of the river, he's impervious to the influences of others. It's a question. Maybe we could speculate, like, why didn't Abraham go? Lot went there. The Talmud tells us that Eliezer, servant of Abraham, went there, but Abraham chose not to go there. He went to Egypt. He went to Canaan. He went all over the land. He chose not to go to Sodom. There's a variety of answers to that question. But we see Lot was a great person. He matched Abraham step for step. Our sources tell us that he looked like Abraham. They were identical. And when our sages tell us that they looked the same, it doesn't mean that they were just doppelgangers. It means they were spiritual doppelgangers. Lot could have been the next Abraham. But he was seduced by the appeal of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he went there, and his story took a very radical turn as a result. Why didn't Abraham intervene? Why didn't he stop Lot from going there? When you see a friend about to do a catastrophic thing, a terrible decision, shouldn't you try to stop them? Why didn't Abraham stop Lot from making this terrible mistake? So I did see, if you look at chapter 13, verse 11, with the Rashi commentary, Rashi says that Lot departed from the east and headed west. And if you have a little sense of the geography, if Lot went to Sodom and Gomorrah, he should have gone east, really southeast from where Abraham was stationed. So I saw one of the commentaries says that Lot did a little pump fake. He says, Abram, I'm leaving. He heads west just so Abram doesn't know that he's actually going. He's going to circle around and head down to Sodom and Gomorrah. He knew what Abraham would think about that. So one of the sources actually says that Abraham never knew that Lot actually made this poor decision. So that may be the answer. But the simple interpretation is that, well, Lot made a decision and Abraham does not seem to try to prevent that. Why didn't Abraham try to stop it? We see how Lot devolved as a result of this decision. Could it be that Abraham was able to persuade and sway the opinions of everyone in the world, but not his own family member? Some may argue, well, it's harder to change the opinions of your family. It's better to go out and deal with strangers. You could have more of an influence upon them. Or maybe Lot was so convinced in his own righteousness that he would not be receptive to what Abraham said. Or maybe there's a limit on how much you can influence others. You recall perhaps in the book of Numbers, it tells us that the people sent spies to go reconnoiter the land. And this was a terrible decision and it led to catastrophe. My grandfather, blessed memory, asked this question: why did Moshe sign off on this? He knew it was a dicey and dangerous decision to not trust God and to not just say, we'll trust you. Now we have to explore the land ourselves just to know the defenses. My grandfather, blessed memory, used to say that sometimes when you see someone making a mistake, you're not supposed to stop them. They're convinced it's the right thing to do. Let them do it. It actually might be the correct decision to allow them to make an enormous blunder. So here's the dilemma. Abraham does not intervene when Lot does a terrible, cataclysmic decision to go to Sodom and Gomorrah. And here's the dilemma. When you see a close friend, an acquaintance, someone that you know, someone that you care for, someone that you love, about to make a horrific mistake, do you stop them? Do you let them make a mistake and maybe learn from it? Maybe if they hit rock bottom, it's actually the best thing for them. That's an interesting dilemma, a dilemma to consider. And that is a wrap on the first Parsha Podcast Live. This was so enjoyable and delightful. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. If you are just listening to it on the podcast, did you like it? Was it any different? Did I sound different? Is it the same? Let me know. My email address is rabbi@wolbachman.com. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful, splendid, terrific rest of your day. I hope your team wins the election, whichever that may be. Have a wonderful rest of your week. A splendid, sensational, terrific, uplifting Shabbos upcoming. And please, God, with help of the mighty, we'll gather again Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Central on torchzoom.com and on the podcast for the next edition of the Parsha Podcast with the help of the Almighty. Again, the email address is rabbi@wolby@gmail.com. I look forward to your questions, your comments, and your feedback.